This episode is personal to me because I'm talking about something I'm working on myself, health, and specifically getting regular health checks, addressing distractive patterns and building accountability. And those are the things that I want to discuss in this episode today. Yesterday, I started putting out a health regime in place. I made an appointment with the doctor for a full checkup, restarted my gym membership again, and even took my blood pressure. Let me be honest, this hasn't been my strong point, but as Proverbs 22:3 says, and I love how the easy read version puts it, wise people see trouble coming and get out of its way, but fools go straight to it and suffer for it. Prevention is better than cure, in essence. Solomon here links foresight with wisdom. Or another version, another rendering of this verse reads, sensible people will see trouble coming and avoid it, but an unthinking person will walk straight into it and regret it later. So let's not be unthinking, guys. Here's the reality. Studies show that up to 65% of men avoid seeking medical help for as long as possible. And that's me. But I'm saying to all of us, let's be sensible and get checked. There's absolutely nothing wrong with seeking medical help. It doesn't mean you lack faith. Think about it. After Jesus healed the 10 lepers, he told them to go get checked by the priests. This is in Luke 17. In the Old Testament, priests were instructed to examine illnesses and even quarantine those infected. That's in Leviticus 17. The God who parted the Red Sea, fed his people miraculously, and brought water from a rock, still established laws for health checks. The same God cares about our health today. Take King Hezekiah, for example, in 2 Kings 20. He fell seriously ill and was close to death. The prophet Isaiah brought him a message from God, and Hezekiah cried out in prayer. God responded by extending his life for another 15 years. But here's the key part. God instructed Isaiah to apply a poultice, a form of medicine, to Hezekiah's boil, and he recovered. Medicine was part of God's plan for his healing. There's nothing wrong with medicine, guys. Let's get checked. Even in modern times, we see examples of faith and medicine working together. Creflo Dollar, a great teacher of faith, has shared his testimony of overcoming cancer, COVID-19 complications, and shingles. God healed him, often through the hands of doctors. So listen to this powerful testimony. It's a powerful reminder.
Sharing this testimony today is so vital to me because I learned that it's not a sin to go to the doctor. I learned that it's not a sin to have a medical procedure. I learned that I could stand in faith and trust and receive the promise of healing and the word and still not be afraid of having to stand strong on what the word of God had to say. I woke up in the middle of the night and my feet were hot. I mean, they were really, really hot. And the next day I went to the doctor to get a COVID test and found out that I had contracted COVID. And so I camped out in the basement and, got my scriptures like I normally would do and trust God and confess my scriptures, confess my healing, and did everything that I would normally do. Only this time it was just a little different. I was actually in a fight. In fact, the fight became great. I discovered that I had micro blood clots around my lungs and they were closing in. My oxygen level had dropped so low that I should have been to the hospital. And we contacted our doctor and they sent protocols out and they were taking care of me. But it started getting my life worse. No sooner than we're out of that, I had a bout with the shingles. And I thought, what is this? The perfect pattern from my spine across my chest and the shingles, the boils. The pain was the most excruciating pain I've ever experienced. But I did question God, like, what's happening? Have I angered you? And so I asked God, why'd you allow this to happen to me? I'm like, I thought I was your man. What's going on? And at that point, I knew in my spirit, I needed to understand what it meant for God's grace to be sufficient for me. I know what Paul said, but what does it mean for God's grace to be sufficient for me? And then finally, no sooner than that was over with, I discovered I had cancer and I had 3 tumors in my body. And it was still standing in faith, but going to get treatment and getting treatment like 2 or 3 times a week. And this is what really hit me. After the treatment, everything looked great. It looked like we had it together. It all reversed. And only in 1 week's time, the numbers were worse than they were before. And I lost it. I broke down in tears in front of my youngest daughter, and Taffy, She came and assured me, you've done all you need to do. All you know to do. You didn't do anything wrong, because she knows that that's what the enemy will say to you. You did something wrong. And she says, but you know what you have to do now. And I knew it was time for me to get a medical procedure. And we got the medical procedure. All the tumors were gotten both inside and out, and I'm healed. And at that point, God was like, okay, what have you learned? And I learned so much. God definitely gets the glory out of the fact of I had 3 tumors in my body, and they're not there anymore. And I'm healthy. And not only am I healthy, but I'm inspired to evaluate the wisdom that I got out of it. The wisdom I got out of it was, I said I depended on God, but I would take 80 supplements a day. I found out later that, taking so many supplements might have actually had something to do with the situation. So I learned how to really truly depend on God. And out of that it's one thing to say I depend on God. It's another thing to walk a walk of depending on God. The glory that God gets out of it is that I learned the importance of understanding that His grace is sufficient. His grace is enough. And in that grace, there's wisdom, knowing what to do.
Guys, it's November, a time to raise awareness about men's health. So let's prioritize our health. Book that checkup. Talk to your doctor. There's no shame in it, and it could save your life. Let's be wise. Let's be sensible. And let's look after ourselves, our families, and our communities. What do Samson and Solomon and some of the most brilliant minds in our world today have in common? Incredible potential and patterns of behavior that destroy parts of their lives. So I'm also talking about how destructive cycles begin, how they spiral out of control, and most importantly, how you can break free with the right kind of accountability. Let's be real. Addictions and destructive patterns are all around us in our society. Whether it's substance abuse, it's pornography, it's gambling, or even overworking to avoid your problems, the cycle is still the same. You're trying to fix things alone, but the more isolated you are, the deeper you fall. The first step in breaking destructive patterns is, like always, acknowledging the unhealthy behavior. You can't fix what you refuse to name. Proverbs 28:13 says this: whoever conceals a sin does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. It's about acknowledging an issue before you can deal with it. But acknowledging isn't enough on its own. You also need God and people. You need the strength to face your brokenness and the wisdom to invite others to your healing journey. Psalm 1:1 reminds us how powerful our relationships are. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. Who you allow in your inner circle matters. If you share your struggles with people who gossip or tear you down, it only adds to the problem. So let's talk about these 2 guys from the Bible who were great but let destructive patterns take them down. Samson and Solomon. Samson was gifted with extraordinary strength, but his inability to confront his weaknesses caused him downfall. He ignored all the red flags in his relationships, got consumed by his anger and desire for revenge, and he had significant sexual struggles. His relationship with Delilah is a perfect example of ignoring obvious warning signs. Instead of surrounding himself with people who could guide him, Samson lived isolated, strong physically, but weak spiritually. Now, Solomon, on the other hand, was known for his wisdom, yet he allowed his love for foreign women and their gods to derail him. The wisest man on the earth couldn't restrain from his foolish desires. These 2 accounts remind us that no matter how gifted you are, unchecked weaknesses will grow into destructive patterns. And this isn't just a biblical issue. Look at Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. 2 brilliant minds, 2 brilliant people who failed to set boundaries and deal with unhealthy patterns in their lives, leading to public and private fall. What happened to them happens to so many others. Isolation, when no one has the authority to speak truth into your life, creates a breeding ground for failure. And 2024 hasn't been particularly kind to weakness. Politicians, music moguls, bishops, pastors have had their undealt issues publicly exposed, leading to withdrawal of their influence on their fields of influence, and many times ridicule. I think it's necessary for us to take a deeper look at Samson and Solomon, 2 men with incredible God-given potential who were ultimately undone by patterns they refused to confront. The stories serve as cautionary tales for destructive cycles when left unchecked. Samson was born a deliverer for Israel, empowered by God with supernatural strength. Yet his personal weaknesses, especially in relationships, became his undoing. Over and over, Samson pursued relationships with women who sought to destroy him. His pattern of bad relationships was glaring. Samson repeatedly chose women who didn't share his values or respect his calling. For example, his first wife, the Philistine woman, betrayed him by revealing the answer. Then came Delilah, a woman who persistently tried to find the source of his strength, not for his benefit or for his good, but to hand him over to the Philistines. Yet he stayed, ignoring every red flag. Naivety and failure to recognize danger. Despite Delilah's obvious intentions, Samson continued to trust her. He fell into the same pattern, giving parts of themselves to relationships that were clearly toxic. He ignored the warning signs until it was too late. So was it naivety or just ignoring? But that pattern was his downfall. Over-the-top anger and revenge. When betrayed or hurt, Samson didn't deal with his emotions constructively. Instead, he reacted with disproportionate violence, such as killing 1,000 men with a donkey's jawbone or burning Philistine crops in a rage over his wife being given to another man. His anger wasn't just explosive, it was a destructive force that consumed him. Another one, uncontrolled promiscuity. Samson's sexual issues weren't isolated mistakes, they were a pattern. Judges 16 shows him visiting a prostitute before meeting Delilah. His lack of self-control in this area was a constant theme in his life. Samson's story reveals how destructive cycles work. When we fail to confront patterns of behavior, they grow stronger and eventually take control. Despite his incredible strength, Samson's refusal to address his weaknesses led to his downfall. He was literally blinded by his own choices, both spiritually and physically, and ultimately died under the weight of the very enemy he was meant to defeat. And for Solomon, it was wisdom and foolishness entwined. A man who started with a heart so devoted to God that he built the most magnificent temple for Yahweh. Solomon was the wisest man of his time, yet his story is a powerful example of how even wisdom can be undermined by destructive patterns. A pattern of unchecked desires. Solomon's downfall started with his love for women, a love that spiraled into a pattern of excess. He accumulated 700 wives and 300 concubines, many who were foreign women. This wasn't just romance, it was about power and alliances and ultimately idolatry. His inability to restrain his desires for these relationships became a recurring theme in his life. Compromise led to spiritual collapse. Solomon, the man who built the temple for Yahweh, also built altars for pagan gods like Chemosh and Moloch and Ashtaroth, or to please his wives. This wasn't a one-time slip-up. It was a pattern of compromise that grew over time. Each decision to appease his wives and their gods eroded his loyalty to Yahweh, from devotion to division. Solomon's unchecked patterns didn't just affect him, they set the stage for Israel's division. As a matter of fact, his compromises with idolatry angered God, and after his reign, the kingdom split in two. The consequences of his inability to confront his own weaknesses. Like Samson, Solomon had everything going for him. He had wisdom, wealth, and a divine calling, but his refusal to deal with the recurring issues, his desire, his compromises, his disobedience led to his undoing. So what can we learn from Samson and Solomon? Both men teach us this: patterns left unconfronted will eventually control you. It doesn't matter how strong, wise, and accomplished you are. Without self-awareness, humility, and accountability, even the greatest gifts can be overshadowed by unchecked weaknesses. In Samson's case, it was his impulsiveness and poor relationships. In Solomon's case, it was his excess and failure to resist compromise. These patterns just didn't happen once. They were repeated behaviors that grew into destructive cycles. Samson and Solomon didn't have anyone else close to them who could speak truth into their lives. They lived in isolation, surrounded by people who either enabled their weaknesses or didn't challenge them. If Samson had someone to warn him about Delilah, or Solomon had someone to remind him of his covenant with God, their stories might have ended differently. So let's talk about the types of accountability partners we need in order to avoid falling into these patterns. God doesn't call us to walk alone, He calls us to community. But here's the hope: you don't have to stay stuck in these cycles. Accountability is key. The Bible gives us 3 kinds of accountability relationships, and we need all of them. Supportive partnerships. Think of Moses and Hur and Aaron. When Moses grew tired during the battle, Hur and Aaron held up his arms. This wasn't just about physical support, it was about emotional and spiritual encouragement to keep going when you're ready to quit. Second one was corrective accountability. And at this, I'm looking at David and Nathan. David had sinned terribly, but Nathan confronted him. The relationship required confession and admitting weakness. True accountability. True accountability partners will call you out when you're wrong, not to condemn you, but to restore you. The third one is challenging relationships. Think about Peter and Paul. Paul wasn't afraid to get into Peter's face. When Peter's behavior didn't align with the gospel, there wasn't a fight, but it was loving correction. It was like in your face. These relationships push you to grow and protect you from your blind spots. We all need all three types of accountability partnerships in our lives. So one, you've got the ones that support you in weakness. Then second, you've got the ones that help us confess and turn away from sin. And then the third one, we have the ones who challenge us to be better, even when it's uncomfortable and in your face, almost combative. And here's the best part. Accountability isn't just about pointing out issues or flaws. It's about celebrating victories together. I'm going to show you a funny clip here of a coach and an athlete celebrating after a win. That's what accountability partners do. They walk you through the tough times and cheer for you when you overcome. Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. You weren't meant to fight destructive patterns alone. God created us for community, for relationships that strengthen, restore, and refine us. If you're struggling with a destructive cycle, start today. Acknowledge it, ask God for strength, and reach out to someone who can hold you accountable. Remember, the right people in your corner help you to become the person God designed you to be. Thanks for watching as always. God bless you, and I'll talk to you next week.